Good evening, everybody. It's time for us to start. We're wrapping up just the last passage in Genesis 47, but we're going to spend most of our time tonight, Lord willing, in Genesis 48. So in Genesis 47, we've been over Jacob and his family moving into the land, and Joseph getting them situated in Goshen. And then we get this, it's kind of an aside. It's almost like if this were a movie, this would be a time lapse or a montage or something, where we see starting in verse 13, the famine continues on, and year after year the people of Egypt are coming to Joseph to get grain, and obviously they have less and less to give. And they're kind of running through the hierarchy of stuff that you sell off during a famine. All right, this is a pretty good indication of how they valued things and the order in which you would sell things off. They run out of food, so then they give off all of their money, all of their gold and silver. Then what do they give next? Well, land comes last. Livestock next. And then they sell all in one deal. They sell both themselves and their land. And so here we don't get we don't get them separated out so that we would see the normal order in which those things would be sold off. But later in the law, we'll get a sense for the order that people would sell those things in. What do you think people would sell first in the ancient world, their land or themselves? Themselves. Every day of the week, they would sell themselves before selling their land. Because remember, their land is super, super important. Not just as practically speaking, as their means of generating sustenance for themselves and for their family, but because of what the land signifies, right? Especially for Israel. Right? The land is the promised land. It's their inheritance that was given to their fathers, and they're going to pass it down to their sons. And so we find all kinds of situations in the law where people have sold themselves off into a form of debt slavery, and then eventually sell their land off even. And the law provides some remedies for that. Egypt does not really have any remedies for that. And Joseph, through his shrewd dealing, basically makes Pharaoh the sole owner of everybody and everything in Egypt. All of the livestock, all of the silver, all of the land, all of the people, all belong to Pharaoh. And the arrangement that they set up is in verse 23. Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and for your households, and as food to your little ones." And they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will become servants or slaves to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. All right, so this is something that is perpetual in Egypt. The law is going to promise something better for Israel, that if they sell off their own selves. How long does that situation last? Anybody just remember off the top of your heads? 7 years. Yeah, maximum 7 years. Possibly much less than that. And just to give you some sense of just how seriously they took their land. All right, you would get your own personal freedom every 7th year if you were selling yourself off as a slave. How often do they get their land back? Not 7 years. Every 50th year, yeah, the year of Jubilee. Again, that gives you some sense of just how much relative value, the weight that they put on their land. Right? You'd get your own freedom back every 7th year, but if you sold off your land, you had to wait for 50 years before you got that back.
What good would the land do?
The thing is, you still, Yeah, so they're not going to take you off of your land if you sell yourself necessarily. What they're going to do is different arrangements worked different ways, but if you had a loan out, like a loan of grain or seed against yourself, the first year you would try to pay it back. Right, so you would be working the land and trying to pay back the loan and pay back the interest on the loan. And if you couldn't do that, then you could be taken into debt slavery. That doesn't mean that your whole family is taken off the land, right? So you could be left on the land and could still end up working for the benefit of your master, or at the very least, you're going to have some male relatives living on the land and working it for you. So if your master takes you off of your land and has you working his land, you're still going to have male relatives around, ideally. Now, sometimes, yeah, if you were in a situation where you wouldn't have anybody to work the land and your master's going to take you off the land, then you'd sell yourself and your land in one shot like the Egyptians do here. So historically, we see all kinds of different arrangements for people selling themselves and selling their land because people are just that poor. Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of different ways, but how do they calculate how much they, in other words, if you owed so much,
Mm-hmm.
how long would you work? Or would it be by time, or would it be by amount that they would harvest? Or how would they
Usually grain measurements were done by volume. So you would, I don't remember if the law of Moses sets this out. If they set it out by volume or if they set it out by a certain amount per field. But both arrangements are common in the ancient world. So you would, if you had a loan of grain, you would pay that much grain back by volume plus usually a third. Or sometimes they would put your fields under obligation. So in other words, they wouldn't own your land, but you would owe some of the yield of the land as interest. It could be a fifth, could be a third. I mean, a fifth would be low in the ancient world.
I'm just wondering, it's not per time you work for it.
You mean like how did they divide it up?
No.
No.
When, like for instance, you owed so much.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So you worked as a slave for whoever it is for so much time
Mm-hmm.
in order to pay that back. That's not.
Yeah. So outside of Israel, yeah. So in the ancient world, it was typical to provide wages to your slaves that would basically go into paying off your debt. And so in a lot of ancient cultures, yeah, you would basically work until you'd paid off your debt. It was indentured servitude, essentially. In Israel, you've got that forgiveness every 7th year. And so it doesn't, and that release every 7th year. So it doesn't matter how much you owe. The 7th year, the rest of the debt is forgiven and you're set free. Yeah. So again, the law is very generous in that regard. Okay, so, but yeah, that gives us some sense of where the land of Egypt is at right now, and how wealthy Pharaoh is becoming on account of all of this. All right, these kinds of arrangements, by the way, the law discourages these kinds of arrangements, right? Where, because if you didn't have some sort of forgiveness laws, pretty much everywhere would end up like Egypt here in chapter 47, right? You would end up with, remember we talked about what we call partible inheritance. I know we're kind of going off on a tangent, and I said we were going to go into chapter 48, but we'll get there. All right, so, let's say this is the family plot, and let's say your grandpa, dies, and you have, your father and your uncle. So let's say it gets split 2 ways. All right, and let's say that your father is really, really prolific. Let's say that you're one of, let's try to make the math kind of easy here. Let's say you're one of 8 brothers. All right, so your father's share of the land, your father's share of the land is going to get split into 8 parts. Actually, it would be 9. Let's say that you're one of 7 sons. All right, so we split the land into 8 parts. The oldest son gets a double portion. So technically, we're kind of off on our division here anyway, because we didn't do that with the father and the uncle. So let's say you're the oldest son. You've got your share, and all of your brothers have their share. Let's say that your uncle was not as prolific as your father and only had 1 son. All right, how much of this land is your cousin keeping? The whole thing. And it was not uncommon in the ancient world for people to be bought out by their close relatives. I mean, first off, those were the people that were living around them. If you're going to sell yourself off to somebody, it's not like you're going to list yourself on Craigslist and, somebody from 50 miles away is going to buy you, right? You're dealing with who you live around, and who you live around is your kin. So you would get bought by, a cousin. And ultimately, if these kinds of arrangements persisted, you could have one part of the family get very, very rich at the expense of the rest of the family. So the law of Moses, as we'll see, works to specifically prevent these kinds of things happening, where one line of the family kind of takes over the rest of the family. Because if one of your relatives has to sell himself off into slavery or has to sell his land off into slavery, does anybody remember what's your obligation as a relative under the law? Do y'all remember? It's in Leviticus, I forget if it's 25 or 26. We're not going to go there tonight. But you have to, if you can afford it, you are supposed to buy your kinsman's freedom instead of taking your kinsman's slave, right? And I think there are some specific prohibitions against taking your near kinsman as a slave, right? So these kinds of unjust situations that crop up in Egypt and in the other nations are not supposed to crop up in Israel if Israel keeps the law, right? But that's that's kind of the operative conflict throughout all of Israel's history. What's the one thing that they never do? They never keep the law. Okay, so that takes us up to Genesis 47, verse 27. So I know we kind of got off on a tangent there. Any questions or comments before we wrap up Genesis 47? All right, let's begin with a prayer. Righteous Father, thank you for the great gifts you've given us today. Thank you for the cool breeze that you have given us today. Thank you for the blessing of our time together to study from your word. And thank you, Father, for the gifts that you have given us in your Son. It's in his name that we offer our thanks. Amen. All right, verse 27. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. And they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, Swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. All right, so while everybody else has been enslaved, Joseph's family has remained free and kind of off on their own in the land of Goshen, and they're flourishing. All right, verse 27, they gained possessions in the land, and they were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And here's that phrase again that we've seen all over Genesis, being fruitful and multiplying. All right, so this is God's creation commandment, his mandate, be fruitful and multiply, and it's borne out in this promise that he gave to Abraham, right, that I'm going to turn you into a great nation. And here's where we see it starting in the land of Goshen. And they become even more wealthy. Jacob and his family are already wildly wealthy. But while they're dwelling in Goshen, not only are they provided for in the famine, but we're told that they are prospering, they're gaining possessions in Goshen. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So Jacob's sojourn in Egypt is almost as long as his sojourning in Paddan Aram. His sojourn among Laban was 20 years. Here in Egypt it's 17, and he is now 147 years old. Remember, for the Egyptians, the ripe old age is considered to be 110. And what had Jacob said to Pharaoh about his age?
That he wasn't as old as his father.
Yeah, I've not attained to the years of my fathers. Right? I'm a young'un, he says. He's 147 here, and his time is coming to die. And so he calls Joseph and has Joseph swear an oath to him that he's going to bury him in the land of his fathers. All right, so we're continuing to see this theme carried along as well, right? The land of your fathers, the house of your fathers being very, very important, and Jacob wants to be buried in their burying place where his fathers have been buried. And Joseph here swears essentially loyalty to his father in saying he's going to do what he has been asked to do. And that brings us to chapter 48. Where we're going to begin the blessings. All right, and at any point, if anybody has any questions or comments, jump in. Chapter 48, verse 1. After this, Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is ill." So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And it was told to Jacob, "Your son Joseph has come to you." Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. And now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. As for me, when I came from Paddan, to my sorrow Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem." All right, so Israel claims for himself the two oldest sons of Joseph. And what he's doing here is whenever he says they're mine, he is counting them among the other brothers. He is essentially adopting them as his own children. And what's the reason that he gives for why he wants these two children? I mean, he doesn't necessarily lay it out explicitly like, I'm doing this because of this. But what happened to him? Sorry?
Because they were Rachel's.
Yeah, because they are Rachel's still. Being Joseph's sons, they are still sons of Rachel. And what Jacob is doing is he's essentially padding the numbers for Rachel a little bit here. Rachel was only able to give him two sons, and now he is getting two more sons in Ephraim and Manasseh. All right, and of course, this is brought out before the rest of the blessings that we're going to read, later in the chapter and in chapter 49, because one of the things that this does is it explains why Ephraim and Manasseh are among the patriarchs, why they are among the 12 tribes. As we commonly number them, right? Because Ephraim and Manasseh are, up to this point, have not really been Jacob's sons. Well, now they are Jacob's sons, and they're going to be numbered among the other sons. And so Joseph is going to get essentially a double inheritance through them, Right? Jacob doesn't give him a birthright. Like, there's no tribe of Joseph in the land of Israel. Right? There's no territory that's set aside specifically for Joseph. But he instead gets essentially two through his sons Ephraim and Manasseh. And technically, Manasseh almost gets double. Remember, the tribe of Manasseh splits up and takes two different sections of the land. Now, this is going to be important for not just for Israel's near history, but especially their later history. Think if you were one of if you're part of the later audience, not Moses' immediate audience, traveling to the Promised Land or first inheriting the Promised Land. Imagine if you lived, say, in the divided kingdom, right? And what two tribes dominate the two kingdoms of Israel? What tribe dominates the southern kingdom? Judah. Okay, and we're going to see Judah ends up getting the primary blessing in chapter 49. What tribe dominates the northern kingdom? I'm hearing a lot of different answers. The capital of the northern kingdom, I'll give a hint, the capital of the northern kingdom is Samaria. What tribe is Samaria in? Not in Manasseh, it's in Ephraim. So in the prophets, you'll see Israel referred to as Ephraim very, very commonly, just as you hear the southern kingdom referred to as Judah. Ephraim and Judah, later in the history of the kingdom, basically become the competing forces, right, between the two kingdoms. It becomes Ephraim versus Judah. And this carries on all the way into the New Testament, right? Because the Jews, Judeans, remember, who is it that what ethnic cousins of theirs do they all hate? It's the Samaritans. In other words, those who have been worshiping in Samaria, those who are more or less descended from the tribe of Ephraim. At least they possess the territory of Ephraim and have kind of gone off and done their own thing. All right, so this is the beginning. This is all getting set up really, really early on. Right, that Ephraim is going to take kind of a preeminent place. Now we're going to see that. Let's see, where did we read up to? Yeah, let's go to verse 8. Now when we say that Ephraim is going to take a preeminent position, it still should strike us as a little odd. We'll get an explanation of that in just a second. Verse 8. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" And Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons whom God has given me here." And he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. All right, before we continue any further, who's that supposed to remind us of? Well, it wasn't Abraham who was dim of sight. It was Isaac. All right, and what happens whenever Isaac is dim of sight?
He gets tricked.
Yes, Jacob fools him for the blessing. All right, and here Jacob is about to bless Ephraim and Manasseh, and his eyes are dim. Right, this is cueing us in. We need to have our antennae up. We need to be paying attention and see what's going to happen. So look what happens. Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. All right, now, I'll tell you, we'll read another couple of verses. He blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on, and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. And when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not this way, my father, since this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day. And we'll get to the blessing here in just a second. But the setup is very, very similar, and all the way up until verse 19. It looks like there's another, a confusion of identities here, right? Because we've been told that Israel is dim of sight, and he puts the wrong hand on the wrong son. Right, now, so in other words, it looks like he has them mixed up, which is precisely what Isaac did. He had his sons mixed up. Now, in Isaac's case, it's because Jacob was actively seeking to fool him, and Isaac was fooled. In this case, there's no active attempt at fooling Israel, and in the end, was Israel fooled? Well, no. We've got a couple of things that cue us into that. I mean, first off, in verse 19, he says, "I know." In other words, he's known all along that he's had his hands on the wrong sons. But what happened before he told Joseph, "I know"? Well, yeah, he had crossed his hands, right? But there was something else that cleared the matter up for him. Like if he really had been that dim of sight that he couldn't tell which son was which, he's still not ignorant, because who clears it up for him? Joseph does. Yeah. Joseph, before he can give the blessing, Joseph stops him and says, "No, no, 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 no. This is not the way it ought to be. You've got things mixed up, Dad." And he tries to move his hands to the proper sons. And Isaac says, he unveils at this point, "Yeah, I know. I've done this on purpose." So here, Moses, we're playing off of Jacob's deception of Isaac, except here, instead of deception, everything is kept clear. Everything is kept above board, right? This is a huge turn for this family, right? Because this family's constantly trying to trick each other and swindle each other. And here, Joseph is being, honest and forthright and open about it. And Jacob reveals that he's not been fooled and that what he is doing intentionally. And so he intends to give the blessing to the younger brother, Ephraim. And he says that Manasseh will also be a great nation, but his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. All right, so we talked about how that factors into what happens with the kingdom later after it splits. Ephraim takes the preeminent place in the northern kingdom. This also fits a pattern that we've already seen in Genesis, right? Whenever Israel decides that he's going to bless the younger son and name him the greater son, is that necessarily surprising to us in Genesis? Well, why not? Yeah, that's happened literally every single generation in this book. The younger son gets the blessing. Mm-hmm.
But earlier through the book, it was all through trickery.
Mm-hmm. And here it's not. Right. So we see things kind of turning around. Now, we also know, earlier in the book, it was also by the will of God, right? Jacob was tricking Isaac, and he shouldn't have done that. But we had already known ahead of time that the younger son, Jacob, was supposed to be preeminent. Mm-hmm.
Did Joseph have it, I know he had his inheritance from his father, but did he have it own anything, or was it all Pharaoh's? Or was he having any land for the reason why he was blessed, or he adopted them because maybe Joseph didn't have anything. He was married into Egypt and didn't have any land, or...
I don't think we're ever told explicitly But what we are told is that, remember, the priests are kind of left out of this whole deal that Joseph has set up because they get, I forget where we read that. Oh, here we go. Chapter 47, verse 22. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. All right, so it sounds like that the priestly families do own land. I don't know if we're told explicitly whether Joseph himself owns any of that land. At the very least, but let's think about it this way. Let's assume for a second that Joseph does have a possession in Egypt. And we're projecting forward a little bit. But where does Joseph ultimately want to be buried? Sorry?
His dad wanted to be buried out in Egypt.
Yeah, well, so Jacob wants to be buried in the cave of Machpelah, but where does anybody remember where Joseph wants to be buried? We've not gotten there yet. We're still a couple of chapters away. It's in chapter 50. We can venture some guesses, but this would be something good to hold on to, and kind of in the back of our minds. Huh?
Buried in Egypt.
Well, for now, oh, you know what? I'm thinking much further ahead. Yeah, I'm thinking back to like the end of the Exodus. What ultimately happens to Joseph's remains? They don't stay in Egypt. They carry his bones out whenever the whole nation is departing the land, right? And it's if I remember right, maybe I'm misremembering, but I seem to remember Joseph making that a specific request. Yeah, it's the next to last verse in the whole book. You shall carry up my bones from here. So, Joseph himself, even if he owns land in Egypt, by the end of the book, he has stopped identifying himself as an Egyptian. Right? He's not going to be buried in Egypt. Instead, he's going to be buried in the land of his fathers, in Canaan. Right? So, at this point, it is beyond dispute that Joseph identifies with his father. That he identifies himself not as an Egyptian, but as an Israelite, a Canaanite. Well, not Canaanite really. Somebody who belongs in the promised land of Canaan. A son of Israel. All right, so good question. That's because that has some far-reaching consequences, like whether or not he owns any land in Egypt. All right, so Ephraim gets the preeminent blessing, like we've seen all through the book. And so let's get the blessing itself. Chapter 48, verse 20. So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will pronounce blessings, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. All right, and what the ESV renders mountain slope here is essentially Shechem. He's promising Shechem to Joseph. And I forget where it is later in the scriptures, where we are told, oh, okay, yeah, it's in Joshua. We'll get to that in just a second, where we're told that the city of Shechem is given to Joseph. So here it's translated a mountain slope, but we should think of that as Shechem, because that's the name Shechem. The city name Shechem comes from the Hebrew word for a ridge or a shoulder. Like your shoulders are your Shechems. And Shechem is called Shechem because it sits on a ridge of land. So he has promised him the city of Shechem. One thing that I almost forgot. We need to back up just a little bit. Verse 12. All right, so they're going through kind of this adoption ceremony. All right, so Ephraim and Manasseh have been sitting on Jacob's knees. And Joseph removed them from his knees and bowed himself with his face to the earth. All right, now here's an interesting thing. We have received a couple of notices in the story about Joseph's brothers bowing themselves with their faces to the ground in front of Joseph. Right, and one of the first times that it happens, Joseph remembers the dream that he had back in chapter 37, right? So they're binding their sheaves, and all of their sheaves bow down to his sheaf. Now, that's not the only vision that he has in chapter 37. All right, what's the other dream that he has? Y'all remember? Yeah, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars. Well, what do? They all bow down to him in his vision. And remember, Jacob rags him out for us. Says, do you really think that your mother and your brothers and I are going to bow our faces to the ground before you? Now, we have had a fulfillment of that first vision. We've had a couple of fulfillments of it, where the brothers come and they bow to the ground before Joseph. We have not had a fulfillment of the second vision, where Jacob, and well, his mother especially, because both of the wives are deceased now, or at the very least, where do we read of Leah's death? I've studied ahead, and I have a hard time remembering what I've been over in public. At the very least, Rachel is dead. We've known that for many, many chapters. Right, that's right, that happened before they come down, if I remember right. All right, so obviously we're not going to get any of the mothers bowing to Joseph. We just continue to pay attention through the rest of Genesis. Have we seen a point where Jacob bows himself to the earth before Joseph? No. Pay attention through the rest of the story. Because y'all might see something that I've missed. But as far as I know, that second vision is never ever fulfilled, where the father and mother bow down before Joseph. Instead, what happens here in chapter 48 and verse 12 is a reversal of the vision. Now it is Joseph bowing his face to the earth before Jacob. It's an interesting note. We had said way back in chapter 37 that the only report that we get of the dreams is what Joseph tells us. And in chapter 37, regardless of what we want to think about whether he's faithful or unfaithful, it's quite clear in chapter 37 that he's absolutely full of himself. And we're not given any sort of evidence that Joseph has actually had these dreams and not made them up. The first dream we get a fulfillment of. The second dream we don't. In fact, we get a reversal of it. So it's an interesting thing. I think on both hands what we're seeing is God forcing the family to reconcile in ways that they didn't necessarily expect. Right? So the brothers did not expect to bow themselves down before Joseph, but they do it multiple times. Joseph, we've made the case, ultimately did not expect himself to stay loyal to his father. And yet here we find him making a promise to his father, bringing his sons to his father to receive a blessing, giving them in adoption to his father, clearing up his father's nearsightedness, or what he thinks is his father's confusion. Here, through basically chapter 45 through the rest of the book, everything that we see coming out of Joseph is clearly and explicitly a matter of loyalty to his father. And so the whole family is coming together and reconciling in some important ways. Excuse me.
Rachel died before he had those dreams.
Yes. Yeah. So when we went through chapter 37, we mentioned that Jacob was probably referring to Leah whenever he said, "Will your mother and I bow before you to the ground?" Because at that point, Leah would have been matriarch of the family. She had first wife status anyway, and with Rachel deceased, there's no competition. So, even though she's not biological mother, she is, she's mother in every sense of the word other than biological mother, if that makes sense. So any other questions or comments on this bit before we continue on? All right, so Joseph's two sons have been blessed first. In fact, one of the things that since we're short enough on time, let's chase down a few scriptural parallels. Turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 5. Yeah, we'll just save chapter 49 for Sunday. 1 Chronicles chapter 5. And the chronicler sheds some light on what's going on here in Genesis chapter 48. Just what precisely Ephraim and Manasseh are getting out of Jacob. 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 1. The sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, everything we're going to learn in this little aside here. For he was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's couch, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that he could not be enrolled as the oldest son. Though Judah became strong among his brothers, and a chief came from him, yet the birthright belonged to Joseph. All right, so the chronicler kind of lays it out for us. Judah has a very important, preeminent place, and we're going to see in chapter 49 the kind of blessing that he gets from his father. But it's like whenever we were talking about Jacob and Esau. Right, there's a distinction between the birthright and the blessing. Right, so how does Jacob get Esau's birthright? Well, who does he trick? He gets both of them through trickery. Well, let's get some specifics. How does he get Esau's birthright?
Feeding porridge.
Yes, yeah, giving him a bowl of stew or gruel. Right, yeah, he sells his birthright for a bowl of slop, essentially. And thus he despised his birthright. Right, well then Jacob goes back to Isaac, and then he secures the blessing as well. Right, so remember, the birthright and the blessing are two separate things, and Jacob gets both out of his brother through trickery, as we've said. In this case, the birthright and the blessing, they go two separate places, at least the preeminent blessing. Right? All of the sons are blessed, but Judah's going to get the preeminent blessing. What the chronicler tells us here is that the sons of Joseph get the birthright, and it is explicitly about denying Reuben the place of firstborn. Just like we've said, Jacob compares Ephraim and Manasseh to Reuben and Simeon, his two oldest sons. Because what he's doing whenever he adopts them is he's also naming them the inheritors of the birthright. All right, so they get the double portion. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else here. Yeah, let's also, a couple of short scripture references, just connecting some things together here. Go to Joshua chapter 24. And verse 32. So this is going back to that matter of the mountain slope that Jacob says that he's going to give to Joseph. Joshua 24:32. As for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem, at the ridge, at the mountain slope. in the piece of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. It became an inheritance for the descendants of Joseph. And final scripture reference for tonight, John chapter 4. Let's see, this is Jesus and the woman of Samaria. John chapter 4, verse 5. So he came to a town of Samaria, it is in Ephraim, called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. So we get just these little references to the land that Jacob gives to Joseph, kind of sprinkled through the scriptures. So that's where Joseph's bones are buried, and it is where Jesus meets with the Samaritan woman. So the name in Greek is given as Sychar. All right, well, we've had our 2 bells. Any questions or comments before we wrap up chapter 48? Chapter 49 is going to be a lot of fun. It is poetry, and whereas Jacob up to this point has been kind of restrained in the things that he says to and about his sons, in chapter 49 he's gonna let loose a little bit and tell us what he really thinks about all 12 of his sons. All right, so thank you so much for your questions and your comments and your kind attention this evening.